The final round of the regional academic decathlon had just ended, and the convention center in downtown Chicago buzzed with the energy of hundreds of students, parents, and teachers. 12-year-old Steve Navarro stood quietly near the exit, his navy backpack slung over one shoulder, a bronze medal tucked into his coat pocket. He wasn't thinking about the competition anymore. His mind was still turning over a question one of the judges had asked during the logic round. Can something be true even if no one believes it? His parents, Maria and David, were already making their way to the parking garage. They were proud. Steve had done well, but they were also tired. The drive back to their small Indiana town would take nearly 3 hours, and they wanted to beat the rush hour traffic. "Steve's right behind us," Maria said, glancing over her shoulder. David nodded, unlocking the car. "He knows where we parked." But Steve wasn't behind them. He had wandered back inside, drawn by a colorful flyer taped to a bulletin board near the escalators. It read, "What does it mean to seek truth? Open philosophy discussion, Harold Washington Library, 3rd floor reading room. All ages welcome." Steve hesitated for only a moment before curiosity pulled him forward. He had never been to a philosophy discussion before, but the question on the flyer felt like it had been written just for him. Meanwhile, Maria and David merged onto the interstate, the city skyline shrinking in the rear-view mirror. The car was quiet, the kind of tired silence that follows a long day. An hour passed. Then, too, it wasn't until they stopped for gas that Maria turned to the back seat and froze. "David, where's Steve?" David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean, where's Steve?" "He's not here," she whispered, her voice cracking. Panic hit, like a sudden storm. David fumbled for his phone, dialing Steve's number. No answer. Text went unread. They turned the car around without a word, the silence between them now filled with worst-case scenarios. Back in the city, Steve sat cross-legged on the floor of the library's reading room, surrounded by a circle of university students and professors. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the city outside and the occasional rustle of notebook pages. A professor with silver-rimmed glasses posed a question. "If truth is constant, why do our beliefs change over time?" Steve raised his hand. "Maybe truth doesn't change," he said softly. "Maybe we just get better at seeing it." The room paused. A few students exchanged glances. One began scribbling notes. Another leaned forward, intrigued. "Have you read Plato?" someone asked. Steve shook his head. "Not yet, but I want to." Across the city, Maria and David retraced their steps. Convention center, hotel, nearby cafes. "Nothing." Maria's voice trembled as she described her son to a security guard. "Try the library," he said. "There's a philosophy group that meets there. A kid like that might have wandered in." When they finally found him, Steve was deep in conversation with the professor, discussing the paradox of knowing. Maria rushed in, tears in her eyes. "Steve, we've been looking everywhere." Steve looked up, calm and a little surprised. "Why were you worried?" he asked. "Didn't you know I'd be in a place where people ask questions?" David and Maria exchanged a look, equal parts exasperation and awe, as they walked out of the library. Steve turned back once, eyes lingering on the circle of thinkers, still deep in discussion. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew he'd be back, not just to the library, but to the questions, the wonder, the pursuit of something bigger than himself. By the time Steve Navarro turned 15, he had become something of a mystery in his small Indiana town. He still lived in the same modest house on Maple Street, still rode his bike to school, and still helped his dad rake leaves in the fall. But something about him had changed, something quiet and inward, like a lantern lit behind his eyes. His bedroom had transformed into a scholar's sanctuary. Books were stacked in precarious towers: philosophy, psychology, theology, science fiction. Notebooks filled with questions and diagrams covered his desk. A corkboard above his bed displayed handwritten notes and quotes. Can freedom exist without uncertainty? Is empathy a form of knowledge? What is the shape of a soul? At school, Steve's reputation was mixed. Some students admired him. Others found him strange. He wasn't interested in popularity. He wasn't trying to be understood. He was trying to understand. The philosophy club which had once been a sleepy after-school activity with 3 members and a dusty whiteboard, had grown under Steve's quiet leadership. They now met every Thursday in the art room, a space filled with abstract paintings and the smell of turpentine. The setting felt right, ideas and imagination mingling in the air. Steve didn't lecture. He asked questions. He listened. He guided. One Thursday afternoon, the club buzzed with anticipation. A new student had joined, Lila Tran, a recent transfer from Chicago. She was sharp, skeptical, and fiercely independent. She wore combat boots and carried a leather-bound journal filled with her own questions. Steve welcomed her with a nod. "We're talking about truth today." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Truth? That's a loaded word." A few students chuckled. Steve smiled. "That's why we're here." As the discussion unfolded, Lila challenged nearly every point. "Truth is subjective," she said. "It's shaped by experience, culture, emotion." Steve leaned forward. "But if everyone's truth is different, how do we ever agree on anything?" Lila didn't flinch. "Maybe we don't. Maybe agreement isn't the goal." They debated for nearly an hour. The room was electric. Other students watched, fascinated, as 2 minds collided, not in anger, but in curiosity. After the meeting, Lila approached Steve. "You don't argue like most people," she said. "I'm not trying to win," Steve replied. "I'm trying to see." That was the beginning of a friendship that would shape them both. Over the next few months, Steve and Lila became inseparable, not in the way of typical high school friendships, but in the way of fellow travelers on a shared journey. They walked home together, discussing everything from quantum mechanics to moral relativism. They read each other's journals. They challenged each other's assumptions. Lila brought fire. Steve brought depth. Together, they created something rare, a space where disagreement didn't divide, but refined. Outside of school, Steve began writing essays. He submitted them to youth journals and online forums. One piece, titled "The Ethics of Curiosity," explored the moral responsibility of asking questions with humility. It was published in a national magazine for young thinkers. The recognition surprised him. He wasn't seeking attention. But the invitation to speak at a youth symposium in Indianapolis followed soon after. Standing at the podium, looking out at a sea of young faces, Steve felt something shift. He realized that asking questions wasn't just about seeking truth. It was about connecting people. It was about creating space for wonder, for dialogue, for transformation. Back home, Maria and David watched their son with a mix of pride and awe. He still forgot to mow the lawn, still left half-drunk mugs of tea on every surface. But he was becoming someone extraordinary, someone who could see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. One evening, after a long walk with Lila, Steve sat on the porch, notebook in hand. The stars were out, and the air smelled like rain. He wrote, "Maybe growing up isn't about finding answers. Maybe it's about learning to live with better questions." He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence speak. Steve Navarro had never been one to seek the spotlight. He preferred quiet corners, deep questions, and the kind of conversations that lingered long after bell rang. But by the time he was 16, his quiet curiosity had begun to echo far beyond the walls of his small-town high school. It started with an essay. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Steve sat at his desk, a mug of cold tea beside him and a notebook open to a half-finished thought. What if asking questions is a moral act? The idea had been stirring in him for weeks. He had noticed how some questions opened people up while others shut them down. How curiosity, when wielded with humility, could build bridges, but when used carelessly, could wound. He titled the essay "The Ethics of Curiosity." In it, he argued that asking questions wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a relational one. That the way we inquire into the world and into each other revealed what we valued. That curiosity, at its best, was an act of love. He submitted the piece to a national youth journal on a whim, not expecting much. A month later, he received an email. The essay had been accepted for publication. Not only that, it would be featured in the journal's spring issue. Steve was stunned. He hadn't written it to impress anyone. He had written it because he could not write it. The recognition brought new opportunities. He was invited to speak at a youth symposium in Indianapolis, a gathering of high school thinkers, artists, and activists from across the Midwest. The theme, Voices of the Next Generation. Steve hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't his strength, but Lila encouraged him. "You don't have to perform," she said. "Just be who you are. Ask the questions you always ask." So he did, standing at the podium in a packed auditorium. Steve looked out at a sea of young faces, some eager, some skeptical, all listening. He took a breath and began. "I used to think asking questions was just about getting answers," he said. "But I've learned that the best questions don't close things. They open them. They make space. They invite us to see more, not less." He spoke about the library in Chicago, about the philosophy club in the art room, about the conversations with Lila that had changed the way he thought. He spoke about how curiosity had taught him to listen, to wonder, to love. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then came the applause, genuine, warm, sustained. Afterward, students lined up to talk to him. Some wanted to debate. Others just wanted to say thank you. One girl, a poet from Detroit, said, "You made me feel like my questions matter." That night, back in his hotel room, Steve sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. He felt something he hadn't expected, not pride, but peace, a sense that he was doing what he was meant to do. Back home, the ripple effects continued. Teachers began asking Steve to guest lead discussions in their classrooms. A local newspaper ran a feature on him. "Teen philosopher inspires with questions, not answers." His podcast, The Quiet Question, which had started as a side project with borrowed mic and a free editing app, began to gain listeners. First classmates, then strangers from other states. Each episode was simple. A question, a reflection, sometimes an interview. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just wanted to explore the questions that mattered. One episode, titled, "Is Wonder a Form of Wisdom?" became unexpectedly popular. In it, Steve shared a story about walking through the woods with his dad as a child, asking why trees reach for the sky. His dad had said, "Maybe they're not reaching. Maybe they're just growing toward the light." That line stayed with him. In the episode, Steve said, "Maybe we're all like that. Maybe asking questions is how we grow toward the light." Listeners wrote in. Some shared their own questions. Others shared their doubts, their hopes, their stories. Steve read every message. At school, the philosophy club continued to thrive. Lila remained his closest collaborator, still challenging him, still sharpening him. They co-led a series on the limits of language, exploring how words both reveal and conceal truth. One afternoon, after a particularly intense discussion, Lila turned to Steve and said, "You know what I think your real gift is?" "What?" "You make people feel safe enough to be honest." Steve didn't know what to say, but he wrote it down later in the back of his notebook. At home, Maria and David watched their son with quiet amazement. He still forgot to take out the trash, still left books open on the stairs. But he was becoming someone who could hold space for others, not just with his mind, but with his heart. One evening, after recording a new podcast episode, Steve sat on the porch again, notebook in hand. The stars were out, and the wind carried the scent of honeysuckle. He wrote, "Curiosity is not a weakness. It's a kind of courage. To ask is to hope. To listen is to love." And with that, he closed the notebook, leaned back, and let the silence speak. When Steve Navarro arrived at the University of Chicago, he carried more than books and questions. He carried a quiet longing for something deeper than knowledge. The city was vast, the campus alive with ideas, and the air seemed to hum with the energy of minds in motion. For Steve, it was exhilarating and intimidating. He declared a double major in philosophy and cognitive science, drawn to the intersection of thought, consciousness, and meaning. But beneath every lecture, every late-night debate in the dorms, a deeper question stirred in him. What if truth isn't just an idea, but a person? Steve had grown up with a quiet belief in God, shaped by his mother's gentle prayers and his father's steady, wordless faith. But college was a different world. Intellectual, skeptical, fast-moving. Faith here was often treated as a relic of the past, something to be deconstructed or dismissed. So Steve listened. He didn't preach. He asked questions. He read everything, from Nietzsche to the New Testament, from Buddhist sutras to modern neuroscience. And slowly he began to see a pattern. The deepest questions of philosophy, about morality, beauty, justice, and love, seemed to point beyond themselves. They hinted at a source. In a seminar on metaphysics, a professor posed a question that stopped the room cold. What is the grounding of all being? There was a long pause. Then Steve raised his hand. What if the grounding isn't a concept, he said, but a creator? The room went silent. A few students exchanged glances. The professor, a seasoned scholar with a reputation for sharp wit, smiled. That's a bold claim, he said. Defend it. Steve didn't respond with dogma. He responded with wonder. He spoke of the coherence of moral law, the mystery of consciousness, the ache for eternity that no material thing could satisfy. He didn't argue to win. He spoke to invite. After class, a student approached him. Do you really believe in God? She asked. Steve nodded. I do, but I'm still learning what that means. More students began to seek him out, not just a debate, but to ask, how can you reconcile faith with reason? What if I want to believe but don't know how? That fall, he started a small discussion group in his dorm lounge. He called it the table. It wasn't a Bible study, though scripture was often read. It wasn't a philosophy club, though ideas were always welcome. It was a space for seekers. They brought their doubts, their questions, their stories. They wrestled with meaning, morality, suffering, and hope. They prayed, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes tearfully. The table grew. By winter, they had moved to a larger common room. By spring, they were meeting in a local cafe that stayed open late just for them. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Elias, said, "You remind me why I opened this place, to make room for real conversations." One night, a student named Jordan, an agnostic who had once mocked religion, stayed after the meeting. He sat across from Steve, eyes tired but open. "I came for the questions," he said, "but I think I'm staying because I met someone in the silence." Steve didn't say much. He just nodded, grateful. Outside of the table, Steve launched a podcast called The Quiet Question. It began as a side project, a way to process his thoughts, but it quickly found an audience. He interviewed theologians, scientists, artists, and philosophers, people who saw God not as the end of inquiry, but the beginning. Each guest brought a new lens. Dr. Miriam Okafor, a neuroscientist from MIT, spoke about the mystery of consciousness and how the brain's complexity points to something beyond materialism. "We can map the brain," she said, "but we still can't explain the soul." Father Thomas LeClaire, a Jesuit priest and poet, shared how beauty in art and liturgy can awaken a longing for the divine. Beauty, he said, is God's whisper. Dr. Reza Kamali, a Muslim philosopher, discussed the shared roots of Abrahamic faith and the role of reason in Islamic theology. "Faith without reason is fragile," he said, "but reason without faith is blind." Ava Lynn, a former atheist-turned-Christian artist, described her journey through doubt, grief, and eventually belief. "I didn't find God in a book," she said. "I found him in the silence after my questions ran out." Professor Elena Varga, a Hungarian-born Holocaust survivor and ethicist, spoke about the moral weight of memory. "To remember is to resist despair," she said, "and to forgive is to believe that evil does not have the final word." Dr. Theo Ramirez, a theoretical physicist and practicing Catholic, explored the harmony between quantum theory and theology. "The universe is not just intelligible," he said. "It's poetic." Jules Kim, a Korean-American spoken word poet and former Buddhist, shared how language became her bridge to faith. "I didn't convert," she said. "I was called, through metaphor, through mystery, through mercy." Each episode of Quiet Question explored a single theme. Can beauty be evidence of the divine? Is doubt a form of faith? What if truth has a heart? That last one, "What if truth has a heart?" became his most listened to episode. In it, Steve shared a story from his childhood, The day he wandered into a philosophy discussion at the Harold Washington Library and asked, "If truth is constant, why do we change what we believe?" He ended the episode with a quiet reflection. Maybe truth isn't just something we discover. Maybe it's someone who's been seeking us all along. The response was overwhelming. Emails began pouring in. Some were brief, just a line or two of thanks. Others were long, vulnerable, and raw. A high school teacher from Oregon wrote, "I played your episode for my senior ethics class." One of my students cried. She said it was the first time she felt like her questions weren't a threat to her faith. A young man from the Philippines messaged, "I've been an atheist for years, but your podcast doesn't make me feel attacked. It makes me feel invited. I'm not sure what I believe yet, but I'm listening." A woman in her 60s from rural Canada shared, "I lost my husband last year. I stopped going to church. But your episode on grief and the silence of God helped me sit with my pain instead of running from it. Thank you." Steve read every message. He responded to as many as he could. He created a section on the podcast website called Echoes, a space where listeners could anonymously share their own questions, doubts, and discoveries. It became a kind of digital sanctuary. Some listeners sent in voice memos. One, from a college student in Nairobi, said, "I listened to your podcast while walking to class. It's like having a friend who doesn't need me to pretend I have it all figured out." Another, from a former seminary student in Brazil, said, "I left ministry because I couldn't reconcile my questions with the answers I was expected to give. Your podcast reminded me that maybe the questions are holy too." Steve began incorporating these voices into his episodes. Anonymous quotes, snippets of letters, reflections from around the world. It gave the podcast a sense of community, of shared searching. He also started a monthly listener roundtable episode where he invited a few listeners to join him in conversation. They weren't experts. They were seekers, just like him, a nurse from Detroit, a philosophy undergrad from Seoul, a stay-at-home dad from Ireland, a former monk-turned barista in San Francisco. Each brought their own story, their own lens, and each reminded Steve that The Quiet Question wasn't just a podcast. It was a movement of minds and hearts leaning toward the light. By the end of his junior year, Steve was known across campus, not just as a brilliant thinker, but as someone who made belief in God feel both intellectually credible and deeply human. He didn't convert people with arguments. He invited them with love. The podcast had tens of thousands of regular listeners. But Steve never chased numbers. He chased depth. He chased honesty. He chased the quiet voice beneath the noise, the one that whispered, "Keep asking." And so he did. By the time Steve Navarro reached his final year at the University of Chicago, he had become something rare, a philosopher who was both deeply curious and quietly convicted. He was known not just for his intellect, but for his presence, calm, listening, always asking the kind of questions that made people pause. He still led the table, now a weekly gathering that had outgrown the cafe and moved into a community center near campus. Students came from all disciplines: physics majors, poets, skeptics, seekers. Some came with notebooks. Others came with wounds. All came with questions. Steve never claimed to have all the answers, but he had learned how to hold space for the questions that mattered most. One night, a student named Priya, who had grown up Hindu but now identified as agnostic, asked, "Do you ever feel like you're just making it all up? That faith is just a story we tell ourselves to feel less alone." Steve didn't flinch. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "but then I remember, truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes it's not something we invent. It's someone who finds us." That was Steve's gift. He didn't argue people into belief. He invited them into wonder. His podcast, The Quiet Question, continued to grow. It had become a global community of listeners, students, pastors, scientists, artists, and everyday people who had one thing in common. They were still searching. In his final semester, Steve released a special series called the Longing Series. Each episode explored a different human ache: belonging, justice, beauty, forgiveness, eternity. He interviewed guests who had lived through war, addiction, loss, and transformation. One guest, a former gang member turned youth mentor, said, "I used to think power was about control. Now I think it's about love." Another, a Holocaust survivor named Ruth, shared, "I lost everything, but I never lost a question. Why does love still matter?" And that question kept me alive. Steve's final episode as an undergraduate was titled "The Philosopher and the Carpenter." In it, he reflected on the life of Jesus, not just as a religious figure, but as a thinker, a teacher, a man who asked questions that pierced the soul. He didn't come with a sword, Steve said. He came with stories, with silence, with questions like, "Who do you say I am?" And maybe that's the question we're all still answering. The episode ended with a moment of silence. No music, no outro, just space. After graduation, Steve stood quietly in his cap and gown, surrounded by classmates taking selfies and tossing their hats. He didn't feel the need to celebrate loudly. He felt something deeper, a quiet joy, a sense of alignment. The dean, in her commencement address, mentioned him by name. Some students challenge our minds. Others touch our hearts. Steve Navarro did both. He reminded us that faith and reason are not enemies, but dance partners. Later that evening, Steve returned to the library where it all began, the same building where, as a 12-year-old, he had wandered into a philosophy discussion and asked a question that changed everything. He sat in the reading room, now empty, and opened his notebook. He wrote, "I used to think truth was something I had to chase. Now I think it's someone who's been walking beside me all along." He closed the notebook, stood, and walked out into the night. He didn't know exactly where the road would lead: graduate school, ministry, writing, maybe all of it. But he knew this. He would keep asking. He would keep listening. And wherever he went, he would keep setting the table. Because in a world full of noise, Steve Navarro had learned how to make space for the quiet question. And in doing so, he had become what he had always longed to be: a philosopher who pointed to the divine.